Good morning. Uh, I hope that you remembered to turn your clock forward, spring forward last night. But if you didn't, the one good thing about technology is that you can join Sunday school lesson anytime and you can join worship anytime that fits your schedule. I hope everyone's doing well and that you've enjoyed a great week. Today, we're going to continue with Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. It's session 2 of the quarterly, and it comes from chapter 2 in the book of First Thessalonians. Paul, Silas, and Timothy had gone to Thessalonica after leaving Philippi, where they had been treated badly. But that didn't stop them from teaching and preaching what they knew to be the true gospel. As usual, Paul spent time teaching in the synagogue first to the Jewish population, but he also spoke publicly in the marketplace or other venues addressing Gentiles, possibly some other Jews as well, and anyone else who would choose to listen. The missionary team was in Thessalonica only a short time before trouble began to stir again for them, and they were forced to leave. Because Paul wasn't there long enough to see the young church mature, he wrote letters to encourage them to remain true to what they had been taught in the presence even of opposition and possible persecution. People who were against the gospel being preached were accusing Paul of being a false teacher who was just manipulating the Thessalonians. So, the part of the letter that we'll study for today is Paul's response to such accusations. He, Silas, and Timothy had lived godly lives in obedience to God. They taught the gospel and they backed it up by demonstrating the genuineness of a Christian commitment. Paul was relying on the Thessalonians to remember how the missionary team had lived among them in the short time that they were able to be there. Now, the first scriptures for today will come from chapter 2, and it's verses 1 through 2. For you yourselves know, brothers and sisters, that our visit with you was not without result. On the contrary, after we had previously suffered and were treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know, we were emboldened by our God to speak the gospel of God to you in spirit of great opposition. Paul addressed the Thessalonians with affection when he used the terms brothers and sisters. He genuinely cared for the people he had met and preached to in that city. They and Paul had shared a history of what took place while Paul's ministered to them. God had been at work in Thessalonica, and the conversions they witnessed, along with their perseverance even after the missionaries left, was proof of a fruitful mission. Paul reviewed the hardships that he and his team had encountered in the beginning of their ministry in all of the Macedonia area. In Philippi, they had endured insults, abuse, shaming, and physical attacks. At one point, Paul had commanded an evil spirit to leave a young slave girl who had followed the men around for days, shouting that Paul and Silas were servants of the Most High God and they were teaching people how to be saved. Well, her owners had made a lot of money on her fortune telling, so they were not happy with the spirit leaving her. And they incited the crowd to agree with them and took Paul and Silas before the magistrate, where they were beaten and thrown into jail on the basis of these false charges. Now, they were Roman citizens. They didn't get an opportunity to say that they were Roman citizens. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been put in jail, because Roman citizens should never have been beaten or put in jail without a trial. But the next day, the city leaders evidently realized their mistake, and in trying to make amends for it, they urged the two men to leave town for their own safety. Now, in spite of the unfair and abusive treatment that they continued with their ministry into Thessalonica, knowing that the opposition would still exist, instead of allowing fear to hinder their preaching, it says, we even became more emboldened. They became more bold in their ministry. In fact, The enemies in Philippi followed them to Thessalonica and accused them of treason against Caesar. Now, if Paul and his friends had allowed their persecution to stop them from spreading the gospel, the Thessalonians would not have heard the truth. And also, other areas of the world where they were spreading the message would not have heard. So God uses people even in the midst of troubled times. Now, our next section will be verses 3 through 6. For our exhortation didn't come from error or impurity or an intent to deceive. Instead, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please people, but rather God, who examines our hearts. For we never used flattering speech, as you know, or had greedy motives. God is our witness, and we didn't seek glory from people, either from you or from others. Even after Paul left Thessalonica, it seems there were still some adversaries attacking his ministry. From his response in these verses, it appears these opponents were trying to convince the believers in that city that Paul had been just a false teacher and he was trying to take advantage of them. Now, false teachers were notorious for trying to draw in large crowds and large profit gains. They appealed to the desire of listeners to claim that they had great wisdom, so their messages never stepped on anyone's toes. Their messages were meant to gain approval and support from the followers. Now, if they began to lose their financial support, they would just move on to another area and to another set of victims. Their goal sort of reminded me, when I was studying this initially, to some modern day TV evangelists, maybe even some mega church pastors who want large crowds of followers and ask for money so that God will bless the givers, while their lifestyles are extremely luxurious and extravagant. And it makes you wonder if the monetary donations are used to further God's kingdom or a personal bank account somewhere. Well, Paul could easily address those accusations by how he lived among and taught the Thessalonians. Paul's message was centered around Christ and the urgency of listeners to believe and follow Christ's example. God had selected Paul and the missionaries to deliver the message they brought. And it was not to please the people like the messages of the false teachers. Obviously, there were many that Paul's message did displease. So that accusation had no basis for truth. He encouraged the church to remember if he or Silas or Timothy had ever used flattering words or false praise to gain favor among the population. They had simply delivered the truth of the gospel as God had entrusted them to do. Now, some teachers did move through Macedonian areas and were more concerned with their income than with the people hearing the truth. But Paul never sought money, and he did not alter his message to please the listeners. His actions and his words were motivated by a divine call under God's scrutiny. Paul implored the recipients of his letter to look back and evaluate his actions and his interactions with them while he was there. They would find no memory that could indicate that Paul and the other two missionaries were acting out of any kind of gain of glory for themselves. So now we're going to move on to the next scriptures, which will be verses 7 and 8. Although we could have been a burden as Christ's apostles, instead we were gentle among you as a nurse nurtures her own children. We cared so much for you that we were pleased to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. Paul and his companions could have made themselves a burden to the church. It was customary that apostles would not have secular jobs because they would be financially supported by the church. But Paul was more concerned about what was the right thing to do rather than what he had a right to do. So just because he could get financing from the church didn't mean that it was the best way for him to interact with the people. His gentleness with them was compared to a mother or a nurse caring for a child out of love, not out of obligation, but out of love. The example that his life set before them communicated the truth of the matter more so than his words of rebuttal to his critics. People in general don't really care how much you know and how much you can teach them until they know how much you care about them. And that was Paul's goal, to show that he cared about them. Paul's actions demonstrated his love and his concern for the new believers. Paul, Silas, and Timothy shared the gospel, but they also shared their lives with the Thessalonians. They became participants in the church and in the community, both in the blessings and in hardships. And they did so because the believers were important to them and they were beloved by the missionaries. Now, members of a church today are supposed to be participants as well. If you look up the word participant in a dictionary, you're going to find that it says it's a person who takes part in or becomes involved in a particular setting. Not one who just attends and goes home, but one who becomes a part of, a participant, a involved. Now that's a good statement for us to pause for a personal evaluation. How involved are each of us in the business of our church and in our church family? Paul participated during the good times and during the bad times, and I believe that true participants with a true heart of caring, by becoming involved and working together, have the ability to turn bad situations into good ones, and everyone comes out being blessed. Now, our last scriptures for today are verses 9 through 12. For you remember our labor and hardship, brothers and sisters, working night and day, so that we would not burden any of you. We preached God's gospel to you. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how devoutly, righteously, and blamelessly we conducted ourselves with you, believers. As you know, like a father with his own children, we encouraged, comforted, and implored each of you to walk worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. To emphasize how Paul and his companions had not taken advantage of the new church by asking for financial support, he reminded them of how they had worked well beyond a normal workday. They worked into the night for self-support while still preaching the gospel. Paul went to great lengths to suppress the idea that he might be selling the gospel or only ministering for the money. He reminded the Thessalonians of his behavior, and with three adjectives: he had lived devoutly. In other words, his life was one that would be pleasing to God. It was not motivated by self-interest or selfish gain. It was to please God. He had righteously obeyed the guidance of God. The Thessalonians could truthfully attest that Paul was not a crook. He had obeyed the laws of God, and he had obeyed the laws of humanity. Paul had lived blamelessly, not that he had lived without sin, because none of us does, but his lifestyle was one where these charges could not stand against him. Paul likened his affection and concern for the believers to a father who wants the best for his children. As a loving father would do, Paul encouraged, he comforted, and he implored the new believers. He supported them and he directed them toward positive behavior, as well as offered empathetic support during difficulties and disappointments. He insisted on the truth of the gospel and the goodness of pleasing God. He wanted them to focus on what truly matters in their lives. The way Paul interacted and worked with the new believers was like a spiritual father leading his children in a positive and constructive manner. His actions easily refuted his critics and also provided an example of how believers are to treat each other, not only then, but now as well. Now, we might need to think of ways to demonstrate compassion more effectively for others and to thank God for the example of Paul and Timothy and Silas. In our prayers, let us remember to ask for ways to become more persistent, yet gentle, in sharing the gospel. There was a hymn that was titled, So Send I You, and it's been tagged as the best missionary song of the 20th century. It was written by a 22-year-old young lady, Margaret Clarkson, in 1954. At the time she wrote this song, she was living in the far northern lumber camps in Canada. She had experienced loneliness of every kind. She had experienced mental loneliness, cultural loneliness, and spiritually, because there was no church fellowship for her to join. And because of a physical disability, she was never able to serve as a missionary. But in studying the Bible, she connected with all the hardships that Paul and the early missionaries had encountered. However, in a few years after that, she actually met some real missionaries. And she realized that she had written this song that told only of the sorrows and the hardships of the missionary call. So she wrote another version, another set of lyrics. She used the same music, but this time her words focused on the glory and the hope of the missionary calling. It was published in 1963, but by that time, the original version that she had written in 1954 was in print in hymnals, and it was widely accepted. Now, she preferred the second version after she had met the missionaries, but the first one identified with the experiences of Paul, Timothy, and Silas. And I'm going to play that original version that speaks so clearly of the hardships encountered by the early missionaries and possibly current missionaries as well. But before I do, I'd like to say thank you for joining in today and let you know that we surely would love to have you join us in person for Sunday school and for worship service. But we're certainly glad to have you join us online if that's the only way that you can get with us. So have a great week. And you know, I have to click all these little tiny squares that are so far away, and my mouse is not wanting to work now. Really? Okay. It's going to take just a minute for me to get this thing going. And it only lasts a few minutes, so I hope that you can stay long enough to enjoy this song. Think about Paul, Silas, and Timothy.
So send I you to labor unrewarded, to serve unpaid, unloved, unsought, unknown, to bear rebuke, to suffer scorn and scoffing. So send I you to toil for me alone. So send I you to bind the bruised and broken, or wandering souls, to work, to weep, to wait, to bear the burdens of a world weary. So send I you to suffer for my sake. So send I you to loneliness and longing, with hearts a So send I you to know my love alone. And as the Father hath sent me, so send I you. And as the Spirit hath comforted me, so He'll comfort you. So send I you to leave your life's ambition, to die to dear desire, self will resign, to labor long and love where men revile you. So send I you to lose your life in mine. As the Father hath sent me, so send I you. And as the Spirit hath comforted me, so He'll comfort you. So send I you to hearts made hard by hatred, to eyes made blind because they will not see, to spend the wind, be blood to spend and spare not. So send I you to taste of Calvary.
Even today in our modern world, we're blessed that the early missionaries did remain faithful to their calling. So count your blessings every day and have a good week.